sky hung low and bruised, the color of an old bloodstain on saddle leather. Silas Reed rode into the nameless settlement beneath it. The dust of 3 days' hard riding ground into the creases of his coat and the lines of his face. Grief was his saddle companion, heavier than the worn colt on his hip. Cora's laugh, silenced 2 months back by Comanche raiders who left only smoke and silence, echoed in the hollow places the wind couldn't reach. He came for a rifle, not just any rifle, a tool for final reckonings, inscribed with names on a brittle scrap of paper folded deep in his pocket. The air tasted of alkali and despair. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I got something extra special saved just for you. The town wasn't much. A sagging saloon exhaling stale beer fumes, a boarded-up assay office, a general store with grimy windows. At the far end, past the skeletal remains of a corral, stood the place Silas sought, a low, stone structure with a single, smoke-blackened chimney coughing thin, gray tendrils into the oppressive air. A crude sign burned into warped wood proclaimed it simply, Croft's Forge and Metalwork. It looked less like a gunsmith's, more like a place things want to be unmade. Silas dismounted, the leather creaking in protest. He looped the reins over a rusted hitching post, the mare lowering her head with a weary sigh. The silence here was different, thicker, absent the usual clatter from saloon, replaced by the distant rhythmic clang, clang, clang of hammer on metal from within the forge. He pushed open the heavy, iron-bound door. The heat hit him first, a physical blow carrying the stench of coal, hot metal, and something else, something coppery and foul beneath it. The interior was a cave of shadow and firelight. Tools hung like strange fruit from smoke-darkened beams. Anvils stood like ancient monuments. And at the heart of the gloom, near the roaring forge mouth, stood a man, Elias Croft. He wasn't tall, but thick-set, powerful shoulders straining his soot-stained leather apron. His face, lit from below by the furnace glow, was a landscape of scars and hard angles. His eyes chips of obsidian that flicked up to Silas with no welcome, only assessment. He didn't stop hammering the glowing bar of iron clamped in his tongs. Clang, clang. Silas's gaze swept the shop, searching for the gunsmith bench. It landed instead on the far wall, near a stack of rusted wagon wheels. His breath hitched, a sharp intake of the foul air. An iron cage, like something for a large, dangerous animal. And inside it, curled against the bars, was a woman. She was young, maybe 20, dressed in torn, dirty calico that might have once been blue. Dark hair, matted and streaked with ash, half of her face pressed against her knees. But Silas saw the raw, angry welt on her forearm, crusted with dried blood and grime. He saw the tremor that ran through her thin frame, a vibration not of fear, but of exhaustion pushed beyond breaking. Her hands, small and surprisingly clean against the filth, were clenched tightly around something hidden in her palm. She didn't look up. The hammering stopped. The sudden silence was louder than the noise had been. "Help you?" Croft's voice was gravel scraped over stone. He plunged the iron bar into a nearby water trough. Steam erupted with a violent hiss, momentarily shrouding him. Silas tore his eyes from the cage. The sight ignited a cold fury deep in his gut, colder than the grief. It felt obscene, a violation that scraped against the raw wound Cora's absence had left. He forced his voice level. "Reckoner Croft. Heard you craft specialty rifles." Croft wiped his hands on his apron, leaving dark streaks. He stepped closer, the forge light casting shifting shadows that made his scarred face seem to writhe. His eyes, flat and dark, flicked again to Cage, then back to Silas. "Depends. What specialty you needing?" He didn't offer a name, a handshake. His posture was a wall. "Sharps," Silas said, keeping his gaze steady on Croft, though his peripheral vision remained locked on the huddled figure. 50 caliber, long range, peep sight, good for distance work. He tapped the folded list in his pocket of phantom weight. Croft grunted, a sound like rocks tumbling. He moved toward a workbench littered with gun parts, barrels, stocks in various stages of carving. He picked up a half-finished stock of dark walnut, running a thick thumb along the grain. Got one near done. Good piece. Hardwood, rifling tight. He looked up, his gaze sharp. Costs, coin, or trade. Silas ignored the implication of trade, his jaw tightening. He took a deliberate step towards a cage. The woman flinched, a minute tightening of her shoulders, but still didn't raise her head. He saw the heavy padlock securing the door, the thick iron bars. What's she for? The question was low, dangerous. Croft's expression didn't change, but a subtle tension coiled in his thick neck. None of your damn business, mister. She ain't part of the rifle trade. He set the stock down with a thud. You want the sharps or you just sightseeing? Silas stopped a few feet from the cage. He could smell her now. Unwashed skin, old blood, despair. And something else, faint beneath it, like crushed sage. He saw the knuckles of her clenched hand whiten around the hidden object. Looks like a cage for a person, Silas stated, his voice dropping to a near whisper that carried in the sudden quiet of the forge. Only the fire crackled. Looks and fool you. Croft moved now, placing himself between Silas and the cage. He wasn't holding a weapon, but his hands, hanging loosely at his sides, looked capable of snapping timber. She's dangerous. Got a wildness. Tried to gut me with a hoof pick last week. Needs containing. For her own good. Mine. His justification was flimsy, tossed out like refuse. His eyes held no concern, only possession and a warning. Wildness. The word echoed in the stifling air. Silas thought of Cora, fierce and bright, tending their garden in the desert sun. He thought of the raiders, their own brand of savagery. He looked past Croft's bulk, directly at the woman in the cage. Is that true? He asked her, the first words directed to her. Slowly, painfully, her head lifted. Her face was gaunt, hollowed by hunger and hardship, smudged with dirt. But her eyes, Silas felt a jolt. They were a startling, clear gray, like quartz washed clean by a stream. Exhaustion swam in their depths, yes, but beneath it burned a fierce, unbroken light, a defiance that scalded. She met his gaze without flinching. Her lips, cracked and dry, remained sealed. No plea, no explanation, just that look, holding his, speaking volumes in silence. She shifted her clenched fist slightly, pressing it against her chest. See. Croft's voice was harsh, triumphant, silent as the grave. Crazy, best left where she is. He took another step towards Silas, invading his space. The smell of coal dust and sweat intensified. Now, the rifle. You buying or you leaving? Silas didn't move. The image of Cora's body, found among the ashes, superimposed itself over the caged woman. The cold fury crystallized into something hard and purposeful. The list of names in his pocket felt like it was burning. Buying the rifle meant walking away, leaving her here, to whatever containing Croft deemed necessary. The sharps was his tool for justice. But what justice was there in ignoring this? He looked from Croft's scarred, expectant face back to the woman's gray eyes. That unbroken light, that silent plea. It wasn't Cora, it wasn't vengeance, but it was a wrong screaming to be righted, a life caged like an animal. His quest had been solitary, a path walked in the shadow of grief. This was something else. A spark struck in the darkness. Neither is that cage, Silas said, his voice low and rough, but carrying an iron certainty. He shifted his weight, his hand hovering near the butt of his coat. The decision settled on him, heavy as stone, yet strangely lifting a weight he hadn't known he carried. The path forked here. He chose the one illuminated by those defiant gray eyes. Croft's obsidian gaze hardened. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He understood the shift. His hand drifted towards a heavy hammer, lying on the anvil nearby. The air crackled. thick with imminent violence. The woman in the cage drew her knees tighter, her gray eyes fixed on Silas, wide and waiting. Silas didn't draw. Not yet. He held Croft's gaze. Open it. The command hung in the sulphurous air. A slow, ugly smile spread across Croft's face. Or what, Pilgrim? You gonna make me? His fingers closed around the hammer's worn wooden handle. He hefted it, the weight familiar, menacing. Reckon you don't know who you're tangling with, or what you're messing with. She ain't just some stray. Belonged to Blackwood. He spat the name like poison. Blackwood. The name landed like a physical blow. Silas had heard whispers on the trail. Silas Blackwood, a renegade, vicious, operating out of the Badlands south of the Cimarron. Ties to stolen army rifles. A man whose cruelty was legend. His name was not on Silas Reed's list. Not yet. But hearing it here, connected to this cage woman, sent a fresh chill down his spine. It complicated everything. Deep in the darkness, the woman in the cage reacted violently to the name. She jerked upright, a choked gasp escaping her. For the first time, true terror flickered in her defiant eyes, quickly replaced by a blazing, desperate fury. She slammed her small fist against the iron bars. Clang! The sound was shockingly loud. She opened her mouth, a raw, silent scream contorting her features. Croft chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. See? Told you. Crazy. And Blackwood don't take kindly to folks stealing his property. He raised the hammer slightly, its heavy head glinting dully in the forge light. Last chance, mister. Walk out. Buy the rifle another day. Or stay and deal with consequences you ain't ready for. Silas's mind raced. Blackwood, a new, terrifying player on the board. The woman wasn't just a victim. She was a target. Freeing her wasn't just an act of mercy. It was declaring war on a nightmare. The weight of his own vengeance, his solitary path, pressed against the raw, immediate wrong before him. Cora's face swam in his memory. Then the woman's terrified fury. The cage bars, the hammer in Croft's hand. He made his choice, not for vengeance delayed, but for defiance now. His hand moved, not to his Colt, but to the heavy iron pry bar leaning against the anvil near Croft. Faster than the gunsmith expected, Silas snatched it up, the cold metal heavy in his grip. He leveled it like a rifle, pointing its blunt end not at Croft, but at the padlock on the cage. Open it. Silas repeated, his voice stripped bare, every ounce of his grief and resolve focused into those two words. Or I will. Croft's smirk vanished, replaced by pure animal rage. He roared, a wordless bellow, and lunged, the hammer swinging in a deadly arc aimed at Silas's head. The forge fire roared in sympathy. The woman pressed herself against the back bars, her gray eyes wide, fixed on Silas, her clenched fist raised like a tiny, defiant shield against the violence erupting around her cage. The name Blackwood hung in the air, a poisonous promise of the storm yet to come. The hammer whistled through the sulphurous air, aimed at Silas's temple. Time thickened like cooling slag. Silas didn't think of Cora or the list, or even the rifle. Instinct, forged in grief and hard miles, took over. He dropped low, the pry bar forgotten in his sudden crouch. The hammer's head passed inches above his hat, stirring the stale heat. Croft's momentum carried him forward, unbalanced by the missed blow. Silas surged upward, not with the pry bar, but with his shoulder driving hard into Croft's gut. The impact jarred Silas's bones, a solid thud against the gunsmith's leather apron. Croft grunted, staggering back, the hammer swinging wildly. Silas pressed the advantage, a desperate fury lending him strength. He slammed Croft against the anvil, the metallic clang echoing like a funeral bell. Croft's head snapped back, cracking against the unforgiving iron. His obsidian eyes glazed, surprise flickering before rage swallowed it whole. He roared again, spittle flying, and swung the hammer sideways, aiming for Silas's ribs. Silas twisted, the hammer grazing his coat, tearing fabric. He saw the woman then, pressed against the cage bars, her gray eyes wide, fixed not on the fight, but on the heavy ring of keys hanging from Croft's belt. Her gaze was a silent command, fierce and urgent. Croft raised the hammer high for a crushing downward blow. Silas lunged not away, but in. He grabbed Croft's thick wrist with both hands, halting the descent. They strained, locked in a brutal dance illuminated by the forge's hellish glow. Croft was stronger, his muscles corded iron from years at the anvil. Silas felt his own arms tremble, the weight of exhaustion and grief suddenly immense. The hammer inched downward. Sweat stung Silas's eyes, mingling with the forge's grit. He smelled Croft's rancid breath, the coppery tang of old blood on his apron. The woman moved. Fast. A small, desperate hand shot through the bars, fingers straining, not towards the fight, but towards the keys dangling near Croft's hip. Her fingertips brushed the cold metal ring. Croft, focused solely on Silas, didn't notice. With a final guttural cry, Silas shoved upwards with everything he had, twisting Croft's wrist violently at the same time. There was a sickening crack. Croft screamed, a raw sound of pain and shock. The hammer fell from his suddenly useless hand, clattering onto the stone floor. Before Croft could recover, Silas drove a knee hard into his groin. The gunsmith doubled over, gasping, clutching his broken wrist, his face contorted in agony. Silas didn't hesitate. He scooped up the pry bar. The woman's hand had withdrawn, her eyes burning into his. He jammed the pry bar's flat end into the gap between the cage door and its frame near the heavy padlock. He threw his weight onto it, muscles screaming. The old iron groaned in protest. He heaved again, a primal sound tearing from his throat. Metal shrieked. The lock mechanism buckled, held for a heartbeat, then snapped with a final, brittle ping. The cage door swung open, shrieking on rusted hinges. Silas dropped the pry bar, breathing hard. The forge air tasted of blood, sweat, and victory laced with dread. He turned to the woman. She hadn't moved from her crouch. Her gray eyes, enormous in her gaunt face, flickered between Silas and the moaning Croft, who was trying to push himself upright against the anvil with his good hand. Terror warred with that unbroken light. "Come on," Silas rasped, his voice rough. He extended his hand, palm up, towards the cage opening. It wasn't an offer of comfort, but a lifeline thrown into darkness. He saw the way her gaze darted to Croft, then back to his hand. Blackwood's name hung between them, unspoken but suffocating. Slowly, painfully, she uncurled. Her movements were stiff, joints protesting after days confined. She rose to her feet, swaying slightly, clutching her right fist tightly against her chest, still hiding whatever precious thing she held. She took a hesitant step toward the open door, then another. She paused at the threshold, her bare feet touching the soot-blackened stone floor outside the cage. She looked at Silas's outstretched hand, then deliberately passed it, meeting his eyes. A silent refusal. She stepped fully out, standing free for the first time in God's knew how long, her thin frame trembling not with weakness now, but with a coiled tension. She kept her clenched fist pressed close. A low groan came from Croft. He'd managed to half-rise, leaning heavily on the anvil, cradling his broken wrist. Hatred radiated from him in waves. "Fool," he spat, blood trickling from a split lip. "You just signed your death warrant. Blackwood, he'll skin you alive for this. Her too." He tried to push off the anvil, his good hand reaching towards a workbench drawer. Silas moved faster. His coat was in his hand, drawn smooth and quick. He didn't aim it at Croft. He leveled it at the drawer Croft was reaching for. "Don't," Silas said, the single word flat and final. Croft froze, his scarred face paling slightly beneath the grime. The gunsmith's eyes darted to the Sharp's rifle lying unfinished on the bench near the broken stock. Silas saw the longing, the calculation. "That ain't yours either now," Silas added, his gaze unwavering. He shifted the Colt's muzzle minutely, reinforcing the threat. He kept the gun trained as he sidestepped toward the workbench. He grabbed the sharp's barrel, still warm from Croft's hands, and the walnut stock splintered near the grip. He shoved them roughly into his worn leather satchel. His eyes swept the bench. Powderhorn led a bag of percussion caps, supplies for his vengeance. He took them too, the satchel growing heavy. He spotted a canteen hanging on a peg and slung it over his shoulder. He glanced at the woman. She stood near the open forge door, silhouetted against the bruised daylight outside. She was looking back at him, then down at Croft, her expression unreadable. Her free hand brushed the raw welt on her arm. "We're leaving," Silas stated, holstering his Colt but keeping his hand near it. He moved toward the door, giving Croft a wide berth. The gunsmith watched him, silent now, but his eyes promised retribution. The woman didn't wait. She slipped out the door into the dusty street. Silas followed, the heat of the forge replaced by the oppressive, dry air of a settlement. He blinked against the sudden light. The street was still mostly empty, but a figure stood in the saloon's shadowed doorway across the way. The barkeep, Silas guessed, a grizzled man with a stained apron, watching him with wary, sunken eyes. The wind picked up, swirling dust devils along the rutted street, carrying the faint smell of distant rain. His mare stood where he'd left her, head drooping. The woman was already there, leaning weakly against a hitching post, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Up close, Silas saw the depth of her exhaustion, the bruising on her neck, the way her torn calico dress hung loose on her frame. She looked impossibly fragile, yet the set of her jaw, the fire still burning in those gray eyes, spoke of a core harder than ironwood. He untied the reins. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice low. He didn't offer his hand again. She looked at the saddle, then back towards the forge door. Fear flickered across her face, quickly masked. She gave a single, sharp nod. Her voice, when it came, was a cracked whisper, rusty from disuse, but clear. "He'll send word." She didn't specify who. She didn't need to. Blackwood. The name was a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. Silas mounted in one fluid motion. He extended a hand down to her this time, necessity overriding pride. She hesitated only a second. Her small hand, surprisingly strong despite its trembling, clasped his forearm. Her skin was cold. He hauled her up behind him. She settled sideways, gripping the back of his coat with her free hand, the other still fiercely clenched against her body. Her slight weight pressed against his back felt alien, a jarring counterpoint to the solitary weight of grief he'd carried for months. He nudged the mare forward. She moved with weary reluctance. As they passed the saloon, the barkeep stepped fully into the street. He didn't speak, didn't block their path, but his gaze followed them, lingering on the woman, then shifting meaningfully back towards Croft's forge. A silent accusation, a promise of trouble passed along. They rode out of the nameless settlement, leaving the clang of the silent forge and the weight of Croft's hate behind. The wind grew stronger, whipping Silas's coat, tugging at the woman's ragged hair. The bruised sky was darkening further in the west, heavy with the promise of rain. Silas scanned the empty, rolling scrubble ahead, the desolation stretching towards distant, hazy mountains. The path to his vengeance lay south, toward the names on the list. But Blackwood's shadow, cast by the woman clinging to his back, pointed east, toward the badlands beyond the Cimarron. He felt a slight shift behind him. The woman's grip on his coat tightened. Then, hesitantly, her clenched fist moved. She pressed something small and hard against the small of his back. He couldn't see it, only feel its shape, cool metal, perhaps oval, with a slight point at one end. She held it there for a long moment, a silent offering, a fragment of trust offered in the vast, threatening emptiness. Then, just as silently, she pulled away, clutching it back to her chest. A low rumble echoed, not thunder, but deeper, more rhythmic. Silas reined in the mare sharply, scanning the horizon behind them. Dust, not the playful dust devils of the wind, but a concentrated plume rising like a brown serpent from the direction of the settlement, maybe a mile back, moving fast. Riders, more than one, cutting across the open land, angling to intercept their path east. Croft hadn't wasted time, or perhaps the barkeep had been quicker than expected. The woman made a small, choked sound, pressing closer against Silas's back, her fear a tangible vibration. Her hidden object dug into his spine like a cold accusation. The Sharp's rifle parts in his satchel were useless now. His Colt held only 6 rounds. The open land offered little cover. The storm clouds offered only a threat. Silas kicked the mare into a gallop, veering north, away from both his Vengeance and Blackwood's known territory, towards the broken hills rising like shattered teeth on the horizon. The wind snatched his breath. The drumming of hooves grew louder behind him, a relentless counterpoint to the thunder building in the west. He didn't look back. He felt the woman's arms tighten around him, her face buried against his coat, a silent plea echoing the one he'd seen in her eyes back in Cage. Freedom tasted like dust and desperation, and the price was already riding hard on their heels. The mare's lungs heaved like bellows as Silas drove her up the first jagged slope of the broken hills. Loose shale skittered beneath her hooves, each slip sending a jolt through Silas and the woman clinging to his back. Her arms were a vice around his waist, her face buried in his coat, the hidden object a hard knot pressed between his shoulder blades. The drumming hoofbeats behind him had swelled into a thunderous roll, closing the distance across the flat scrubland. Dust choked the air, thick as smoke, whipped by the rising wind that now carried the first cold, wet needles of rain. Silas risked a glance back. For riders, low in their saddles, wide-brimmed hats pulled down against the weather. Sun glinted dully off rifle barrels. Too many for his Colt. The unfinished sharps in his satchel mocked him, a promise of long-range vengeance rendered useless by close-range chaos. He veered sharply into a narrow cleft between 2 weather-shattered bluffs of ochre sandstone. The mare scrambled, hooves finding precarious purchase on slick rock. The cleft deepened, walls rising sheer on either side, choked with thorny greasewood and skeletal juniper. The sound of pursuit echoed strangely, amplified then muffled by the twisting passage. He pushed deeper, the light fading as the storm clouds blotted the bruised sky. Rain fell harder now, cold and insistent, plastering his hair to his forehead, washing rivulets of grime down the woman's face. She lifted her head, gasping, gray eyes scanning the narrowing walls with animal alertness. Her knuckles, where they gripped his coat, were white. He felt the tremor running through her, a mix of exhaustion and terror. The cleft opened abruptly into a small, hidden box canyon, maybe 50 yards across. A stony wash, already beginning to run with muddy water, cut through its center. Sheer walls rose on 3 sides. The fourth, where they'd entered, was the only way in or out, a dead end. Silas cursed under his breath, the sound lost in the drumming rain and the ever-nearing pound of hooves. They were trapped. He reined in near the back wall, beneath a shallow overhang that offered scant shelter. The mare stood trembling, head low, flanks heaving. Silas dismounted, his boots sinking into the suddenly slick mud. He turned, reaching up automatically. The woman stared down at him, rain streaking the dirt on her face, revealing pale skin beneath. Her gray eyes held a wildness again, the defiance momentarily drowned by raw panic. She didn't take his hand. Instead, she half slid, half fell from the saddle, landing hard on her knees in the mud. A sharp gasp escaped her, pain etching lines around her eyes. She clutched her right fist protectively against her stomach, the hidden object shielded even now. Silas ignored the approaching riders for a moment. The welt on her arm, crusted and angry, was slick with rain and mud. Her dress was torn further from the frantic ride, revealing dark bruises on her ribs. She looked like a cornered bird, wings broken. He knelt beside her, pulling the canteen from his shoulder. He uncorked it, the sound loud in the relative quiet of the canyon. the riders momentarily masked by the curve of the entrance cleft. "Here," he offered the canteen. His voice was rough, stripped of anything but necessity. She flinched, eyes darting toward the canyon mouth. Then, slowly, her gaze shifted to the canteen, then to his face. Rain dripped from his hat brim. She saw the lines grief had carved, the hardness born of loss, but also the unwavering focus directed towards her, towards the immediate threat. Hesitantly, she reached out with her left hand, the one not clutching her secret. Her fingers brushed his as she took the canteen. They were ice cold. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin, mixing with the rain. He pulled the strip of cleanish cloth he'd grabbed from Croft's bench, meant for gun cleaning, from a satchel. He dipped it in a puddle of cleaner rainwater pooling on a flat rock. "Arm," he said, nodding toward the angry welt. She recoiled instinctively, pulling her injured arm tighter against her body, her hidden fist pressing harder into her stomach. Her eyes flashed with suspicion, then flickered with something else. Shame? Vulnerability? She looked from his face to the cloth, then toward the canyon entrance where the sound of slowing hooves and gruff voices now carried clearly. Time was bleeding away. "Infection kills quicker than lead," Silas stated flatly, holding her gaze. It wasn't kindness, it was pragmatism. A sick companion was a burden he couldn't afford. The logic, or perhaps the sheer exhaustion, broke through. With a shuddering breath, she extended her arm. Silas saw the wound clearly now. Deep, ragged scratches, likely from the hoof-pick Croft had mentioned. It was inflamed, oozing. He cleaned it as gently as he could with a wet cloth, the mud and dry blood washing away. She hissed through clenched teeth, but didn't pull away. Her eyes were fixed on his hands, then lifted to his face, searching. Rain plastered her dark hair to her skull, making her look even younger, more fragile. He tore the cleaning cloth in half, using one piece to bind the wound loosely. As he tied the knot, her free hand, the one holding the hidden object, moved, not to push him away, but to rest lightly, trembling, on his forearm for a fleeting second. A silent acknowledgement, a sliver of trust, hard won. Then her hand snapped back, clutching her secret close. She looked toward the canyon entrance, her expression hardening again. "Lena," she whispered, the word almost lost in the rain's hiss. She didn't look at him, just offered the name like a fragile offering tossed into a storm. Silas nodded once. A name, Lena. It grounded her, made her more than just a cage woman, the object of Blackwood's wrath. He felt the weight of that trust, unexpected and heavy. "Silas," he offered in return, the name feeling strange on his tongue after months of solitude. He rose, handing her the canteen back. "Stay low, behind the horse." He moved to the edge of the overhang, drawing his coat. The hammer was slick with rain. He peered through the curtain of water towards the canyon mouth. 3 riders had dismounted, leading their horses into narrow entrance cleft. The 4th remained mounted just outside, a lookout. Silas recognized a grizzled barkeep from the settlement, a sawed-off shotgun cradled in his arms. The other 2 were hard-faced strangers, one with a pockmarked cheek, the other missing an earlobe. They moved cautiously, scanning the ground, their rifles held ready. "Tracks lead right in here, Jed." The pockmarked man called back to the barkeep. Croft said the woman's worth her weight to Blackwood. "Jed," the barkeep shouted, his voice rough. "Alive. The fellow with her, Blackwood, ain't particular." The implication hung in the wet air. Silas's finger tightened on the trigger. 6 rounds. 4 men. Terrible odds. His original list, tucked deep in his pocket, felt like ash. Cora's face, bright and laughing, seemed impossibly distant, obscured by the driving rain and the immediate, muddy reality of protecting Lena. Vengeance had been a solitary path, a cold fire. This was different. Hotter, more desperate. He saw Lena from the corner of his eye. She hadn't stayed behind the horse. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, mud streaking her dress, to huddle beside him near a large boulder at the edge of the overhang. Her gray eyes were fixed on the approaching men, not with terror now, but with a fierce, calculating intensity. Her right fist was still clenched, but her left hand scrabbled in the wet gravel beside her, closing around a heavy, fist-sized stone. Her jaw was set, the line clean and sharp despite her exhaustion. She was preparing to fight, with a rock. A surge of something fierce and unexpected washed over Silas. Not pity, but profound respect. This caged bird had claws. He shifted slightly, angling his body to shield her better, without taking his eyes off the men now spreading out at the mouth of the canyon, maybe 40 yards away. The man with the missing earlobe raised his rifle, aiming generally toward the overhang. "Come on out, mister," he yelled, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Send the woman forward, nice and slow. Might just let you walk away." Rain dripped from the brim of his hat. Silas didn't answer. He sighted down the barrel of his Colt, the front post wavering slightly in the downpour. He picked his target, Jed the barkeep, the one with the devastating close-range weapon. He took a slow, steadying breath, the cold rain running down his neck. The canyon wall seemed to lean in, amplifying the drumming rain, the nervous snore of the horses, the tense breathing of the woman beside him clutching her stone. He felt the pressure of her presence, the weight of her fragile trust, the sheer insanity of their stand. 6 rounds. For men. And Lena's stone. He squeezed the trigger. The Colt bucked in his hand, the roar shockingly loud in confined space, echoing off the canyon walls like a crack of doom. Jed the barkeep jerked backwards, the shotgun flying from his hands as he crumpled into mud near the canyon mouth. Chaos erupted. Horses reared. The pockmarked man and the one-eared man dove for cover behind rocks near the entrance, firing wildly. Bullets whined off stone, kicking up sprays of mud and rock chips near Silas and Lena. Silas fired again, forcing the one-eared man to duck deeper behind his cover. He shifted his aim towards a pockmarked man who was scrambling behind a boulder. Another shot. Miss. He had 3 rounds left. The 4th rider, the lookout outside the cleft, was shouting, likely bringing his horse in. Beside him, Lena didn't flinch at the gunfire. She was coiled, tense, her knuckles white on the stone, her eyes locked on the chaos at the canyon entrance. Then, suddenly, her gaze snapped downwards. She was staring at her clenched right fist. Slowly, deliberately, as if compelled by the violence erupting around them, she opened her fingers for the first time since Silas had seen her in the cage. Silas caught the movement from the corner of his eye. Nestled in her muddy palm, gleaming dully in the gray stormlight, was a tarnished silver locket. It was shaped like a teardrop, small enough to fit in her palm, its surface etched with intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to writhe like snakes in the dim light. It looked old, valuable, and utterly out of place in this muddy, violent canyon. Her thumb traced the edge, a gesture of profound, aching familiarity. Before Silas could process it, before he could even wonder what it meant, a harsh shout cut through the gunfire and rain from the canyon entrance. It was the voice of the 4th rider, now standing in the cleft, rifle aimed. "Lena!" he bellowed, his voice thick with malice and something else. "Recognition? Blackwood says that locket belongs to him. Give it up, girl, or he'll peel the hide off this fool slow." The man's rifle muzzle shifted, centering unwaveringly on Silas's chest. The rain poured down, turning the canyon floor into a slick brown river. Silas had 2 rounds left. Lena's hand snapped shut over the locket, her gray eyes blazing with a mixture of terror and fury as she stared at the rifleman who knew her name and her secret. The silver teardrop, heavy with unspoken history, felt like a target painted on both their backs. The rifleman's shout, "Blackwood says that locket belongs to him," hung in the rain-lashed canyon like a death sentence. Silas felt the muzzle's invisible pressure on his chest, a cold counterpoint to the drumming rain soaking his shirt. 2 rounds left. For enemies, 1 dead, 1 wounded, 2 active, and this new threat blocking their only escape. Beside him, Lena's hand snapped shut over the silver teardrop locket, her knuckles bone-white, her gray eyes, wide with terror moments before, narrowed into slits of pure fury. She didn't look at the rifleman. She stared at the locket in her palm as if it were a venomous snake, then deliberately shoved it deep into the pocket of her ragged dress. Her other hand tightened on the heavy stone she'd gathered, her body coiling like a spring. The rifleman in the cleft, emboldened by Lena's recoil, took a step forward, his boots sinking into the mud churned by the nervous horses. "Last chance, girl. Hand it over. The man dies either way, but make it quick for him." Rain streamed from his hat brim. Silas didn't wait. He squeezed the trigger. The Colt roared, the sound swallowed by the canyon walls and the downpour. The shot wasn't aimed at the rifleman's center mass. Silas aimed low, at the man's leading leg. The bullet struck the mud just in front of the rider's boot, spraying muck and water. The man instinctively flinched, stumbling back a step, his rifle barrel dipping momentarily. It was the opening Lena needed. With a guttural cry that ripped from her throat, raw, primal, fueled by weeks of caged rage, she hurled the heavy stone. It flew true, striking the rifleman square on the shoulder, where he'd stumbled. He grunted, staggering sideways, his rifle swinging wildly off target. Chaos erupted. The wounded man behind a rock near the entrance, the one with the missing earlobe, fired blindly towards the overhang. Bullets whined off stone. The pockmarked man scrambled, trying for a clearer shot. Silas saw his chance. He grabbed Lena's arm, hauling her upright. "Run. To the wash." He shoved her toward the center of the canyon, where the stony wash was now a surging, muddy torrent, fed by the deluge cascading down the canyon walls. He turned, firing his last round towards the pockmarked man's position, forcing him to duck. Then Silas sprinted after Lena, slipping and sliding on the slick mud. The mare, panicked by the gunfire and the rising water, reared, whinnying in terror. Silas ignored her. She was a liability now. Survival meant the wash. Lena reached the edge of the roiling brown water first. It was waist-deep already, pulling violently at submerged rocks. She hesitated, looking back at Silas, fear warring with resolve. He plunged in beside her, the cold shock stealing his breath. The current was stronger than it looked, tugging insistently at his legs. He grabbed her hand, not an offer, a lifeline. Downstream. "Go!" They stumbled through the torrent, slipping on stones, the water clawing at them. Shouts echoed behind them, mingling with the rain's roar. A bullet splashed into the water a foot to Silas's right. He risked a glance back. The rifleman was regaining his footing, aiming. The pockmarked man was wading into the wash upstream. Try to cut them off. The one-eared man remained behind cover, reloading. Then the canyon groaned. A low, grinding rumble, deeper than thunder, vibrated through the stone. Upstream, near the cleft entrance, a section of the sodden canyon wall, undermined by the torrential downpour, collapsed. Tons of mud and rock slid down with a wet, sucking roar directly onto the path the riders had taken. It buried the dead barkeep completely and slammed into the horses tethered near the entrance. The animals screamed, a horrifying sound. The pockmarked man, caught midstream, was swept off his feet by the sudden surge of displaced water and debris, vanishing beneath the churning brown foam. The rifleman and the one-eared man were momentarily obscured by the cascading mud and spray. Silas didn't wait to see more. He pulled Lena harder downstream, around a bend in the wash where the canyon walls pinched closer together, offering some cover. They staggered on, lungs burning, until the sound's pursuit faded, swallowed by the storm and the canyon's twists. Finally, Silas spotted it, a dark fissure in the canyon wall, high enough above the raging wash to be dry. A shallow cave, little more than a gouge in the rock. He hauled Lena towards it, scrambling up the slippery slope. They collapsed onto the gritty floor of the fissure, gasping, shivering violently. Rain lashed the entrance, but they were out of the direct downpour and the killing current. The roar of the flood was a constant, oppressive drone. Silas checked his coat reflexively. The empty chamber's a hollow feeling. He still had the sharp's parts, the powder, the lead in his saturated satchel. Useless now. Lena huddled against the back wall, knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around herself. She was trembling uncontrollably, her face pale as bone beneath the mud and rain, her eyes huge and staring at nothing. The pocket where she'd hidden the locket bulged slightly. Silas rummaged in his satchel. The powder horn was sealed tight. Thank God. He pulled out the canteen, nearly empty, and the strip of cloth he'd used to bind her arm, now soaked. He offered her the canteen. She didn't react at first, lost in shock. He nudged it gently against her knee. She blinked, focus slowly returning. She took it with trembling hands, drank the last few sips, then handed it back, her gaze dropping to her injured arm. The bandage was filthy, soaked through. Silas dipped the cloth in rainwater pooling near the cave entrance. Arm, he said, his voice rough but devoid of command this time. It was necessity, but laced with something else, a shared understanding forged in the mud and gunfire. She extended her arm silently. He peeled back the wet, muddy cloth. The scratches were angry red, inflamed, but the flowing water had washed away some of the grime. He cleaned it again as best he could with the clean rainwater, the touch impersonal but careful. She winced but didn't pull away. Her eyes were fixed on his face, studying the lines of grief and exhaustion, the set of his jaw. When he finished, he tore another strip from the cleaning cloth and rebound it. As he tied the knot, her free hand drifted to the pocket holding the locket, her fingers tracing its outline through the wet fabric. Proof, she whispered, the word barely audible over the storm. She didn't look at him, staring at the rain sheeting across the cave mouth. What Blackwood did to my family. Her voice cracked. He killed them for it. She didn't elaborate. The weight of the unsaid, the horror condensed into those few words, filled the small space. Silas sat back on his heels, the damp rock cold against his legs. He thought of Cora, her laugh snatched away by Comanche arrows. The list in his pocket felt heavier, the names blurring momentarily. Vengeance had been a solitary star to steer by. Now, there was this, a terrified, defiant woman carrying proof of another monster's atrocity. Cora, he said, the name feeling raw, unfamiliar, spoken aloud. My wife. Raiders. He offered no details, just the stark facts, a mirror to her own confession, a shared currency of loss. Lena looked at him then, truly looked at him. The raw terror had receded, replaced by a deep, weary understanding. She pulled a locket from her pocket, not opening it, just holding the cold silver teardrop in her open palm. The intricate, snake-like etchings gleamed dully in the gray light filtering into the cave. He won't stop, she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. Not till he has this, or me dead. Silas nodded. He understood obsession. He pulled the components of the Sharp's rifle from his satchel, the barrel, the splintered stock, the bag of percussion caps. He laid them out on a relatively dry patch of rock. He had no tools, no forge, but the act of assembling what he could, fitting the barrel into the stock splintered channel as best as possible, checking the percussion nipple, was grounding, a focus, a weapon for the storm still to come. He wasn't just carrying parts anymore. He was carrying a promise. To Cora, and now, silently, to Lena. The rain lessened near dawn, fading to a cold drizzle. The roar of the wash subsided to a sullen gurgle. Exhaustion pressed down on them, but sleep was a luxury they couldn't afford. Silas kept watch near the cave entrance, the makeshift Sharps resting across his knees, useless for long range but a potent club if needed. Lena dozed fitfully, curled around a locket clutched in her fist. As the first gray light seeped into the canyon, Silas scanned the terrain below. Movement. Near the bend where they'd entered the wash yesterday. Not riders. Figures on foot, moving cautiously to the debris field left by the mudslide. 3 men. He recognized a rifleman from the cleft, limping heavily, his shoulder bound roughly. Beside him was a one-eared man, supporting him, and a third figure, thick-set, one arm bound in a crude sling, his face a mask of hatred even at this distance. Elias Croft. The gunsmith had survived, and he'd found them. Croft pointed directly toward their fissure. He bent down, picking something up from the mud near the water's edge. He held it aloft, a dark, sodden shape. Silas's stomach clenched. It was his leather satchel, lost in their frantic scramble into the wash. Inside were the lead shot, the percussion caps, the powder horn. Everything needed to make the Sharps more than just a club. Everything they needed to survive. Croft's scarred face twisted into a vicious smile as he shook the satchel toward the cave. His shout, though faint, carried on the damp morning air, thick with malice and triumph. "Reckon we found your supplies, Reed. Come on out. Let's finish what you started and settle accounts for Blackwood." He tossed the satchel contemptuously into the mud at his feet. The 3 men spread out, rifles coming up, beginning the slow, deliberate climb towards the fissure. The rain might have stopped, but the storm had just found them again, armed with Silas's own bullets. Croft's triumphant shout, "Reckon we found your supplies, Reed," echoed off the canyon walls like a hammer on an anvil. The sodden satchel lay in the mud at his feet, a betrayal of everything Silas needed to make the Sharps more than a club. The gunsmith's scarred face, twisted with malice, was a grotesque mask in the watery dawn light. Beside him, the rifleman clutched his wounded shoulder, his face pale with pain and fury. The one-eared man scanned the fisher's entrance, rifle steady. They began their slow, deliberate climb up the slippery slope, a trio of vengeance and greed converging on the shallow cave. Silas's empty Colt was a cold weight at his hip, the makeshift Sharps, barrel wedged awkwardly into splintered stock, felt clumsy and inadequate in his hands. He glanced at Lena. She was no longer trembling. Shock had hardened into a brittle resolve. Her gray eyes tracked the advancing men, then dropped to the locket she clutched so tightly her knuckles threatened to pierce skin. With a sudden, decisive movement, she snapped it open. Silas caught a glimpse of tiny, faded portraits inside. A man with kind eyes, a woman with Lena's determined mouth, a child's blurry smile, before she snapped it shut again. Her lips moved silently, a private vow. She met Silas's gaze, then deliberately slid the locket back into her pocket and picked up a jagged, fist-sized rock from the cave floor. Her message was clear: "I fight." Silas understood. This wasn't just escape anymore. It was defense. Of her proof, of her life, of the fragile trust kindled in the mud and rain. He hefted the Sharps club. "When they're close," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the gurgle of the receding wash. "The slope's slick, unsteady." Lena nodded, shifting closer to the cave's edge, pressing herself against the cold rock. Her bandaged arm was held stiffly, but her grip on the rock was firm. The men were 20 feet below now, breathing heavily with the effort to climb on rain-slicked stone. Croft led, his broken wrist bound in a sling, his good hand gripping a long, skinning knife. Hatred radiated from him. "Should have bought the rifle and walked away, Reed," he bellowed, his voice raw. "Now you die for a crazy bitch and a trinket." The rifleman, sweating and pale, paused to aim his weapon upwards. The one-eared man scrambled beside him, rifle ready. Silas saw the moment, the slight imbalance as the rifleman compensated for his injured shoulder. "Now!" Silas hissed. He surged forward, not out of the cave, but along its narrow lip. He swung the heavy, sharp stock not at the men, but at a precariously balanced boulder jutting from the slope just above them. The impact jarred his arms. The boulder groaned, shifted, then broke free with a grinding screech, dislodging a cascade of smaller rocks and mud. "Slide!" the one-eared man yelled, diving sideways. The rifleman stumbled backward, his shot going wild, blasting rock chips near Silas's head. Croft, slow with his injuries, tried to dodge but slipped. The landslide of mud and rocks slammed into him, knocking him off his feet and sending him tumbling several yards down the slope, the knife flying from his grasp. He landed with a heavy thud. Groaning, Silas didn't wait. He charged down the slope, not towards Croft, but toward the satchel lying near the water's edge. The rifleman, regaining his footing, snarled and swung his rifle like a club. Silas ducked under the wild swing, driving the butt of the sharp stock hard into the man's wounded shoulder. A scream tore from the rifleman's throat as he collapsed, writhing in agony. The one-eared man fired. The shot cracked past Silas's ear. Silas spun, parrying the next rifle swing with the sharp's barrel. Metal clanged. He drove a boot into the man's gut, sending him staggering back towards a muddy wash. As the man stumbled, Lena appeared above him. She hurled her rock with surprising force. It struck the one-eared man square in the temple. He went down like a sack of grain, face first into the mud, motionless. Silas snatched up the satchel, its leather cold and slick. Relief wore with urgency. He turned to face the slope. Croft was pushing himself up, mud-smeared, his face a mass of pure animal rage. The rifleman was trying to crawl away, whimpering. The immediate threat was broken, but Croft's eyes burned with undiminished malice. "Blackwood will flay you alive, Reed." Croft spat, blood and mud mingling on his chin. He struggled to rise, favoring his injured wrist. "He'll take the girl slow. Make her beg. That locket, it's cursed. Killed her kin. Gonna kill you both." He scrabbled in the mud with his good hand, searching for his knife. Silas didn't move towards him. He opened the satchel. The powder horn was intact. The caps, the lead shot. He looked at Croft, then at Lena, who stood above him on the ledge, breathing hard, her face pale but her eyes blazing. He thought of Cora, killed for no reason, of Lena's family, murdered for silver and greed. The list in his pocket felt less like a map, more like a chain. Vengeance was a solitary, consuming fire. What stood before him now was different, protecting a spark of defiance, a fragment of justice embodied in a silver teardrop and a young woman's unwavering eyes. He didn't need the list right now. He needed the rifle. Silas dropped to one knee in the mud, ignoring Croft's curses. He pulled the sharp's barrel from the splintered stock. With swift, desperate motions born of long practice, he began to load it properly, pouring black powder down the barrel, ramming home a lead slug, pressing a percussion cap onto the nipple. It was crude, the stock cracked, the aim would be terrible, but it would fire. Croft saw what he was doing. Fear flashed through the hatred. He lunged, abandoning the knife search, scrambling up the slope on hands and knees, a wounded bear intent on the kill. "No, you don't get to win." Silas snapped the barrel back into the fractured stock, the fit loose and dangerous. He raised the weapon, the muzzle wavering as he sighted down its length at the charging gunsmith. 10 yards. 5. Croft's roar filled the canyon. Lena moved. She didn't have another rock. Instead, she stepped to the very edge of the fissure opening, directly above Croft's path. She pulled the silver locket from her pocket, holding it aloft. It caught the weak dawn light, the etched snakes seeming to writhe. Elias Croft. Her voice, clear and sharp as broken glass, cut through the chaos. "Look at it. Look at what you helped him steal. Look at what you caged me for." Croft faltered, his eyes snapping upward, drawn by the locket's gleam and the raw power in her voice. For a split second, his charge hesitated, his focus broken by the symbol of his complicity. It was the moment Silas needed. He steadied the wobbling sharps, aimed not for the body, but for the leg. He squeezed the trigger. The roar was deafening in confined space. The kick slammed the cracked stock hard into Silas's shoulder, threatening to shatter completely. Smoke billowed. Croft screamed, a high-pitched sound of shock and agony, as a heavy slug tore into his thigh. He spun, crashing back down the slope, clutching the blossoming crimson stain on his trousers, his rage dissolving into guttural moans of pain. Silence descended, broken only by Croft's whimpers, the rifleman's fading whines, and the rush of the wash. Smoke curled from the sharp's muzzle. Silas lowered the weapon, his shoulder throbbing. He looked up at Lena. She still held the locket high, her arm trembling, but her gaze was fixed on the broken gunsmith. Tears tracked clean lines of the mud on her cheeks, but her jaw was set, her spine straight. She lowered her arm slowly, clutching the locket back to her chest, a silent monument to survival. Silas stood, wincing. He walked over to Croft, who glared up at him through a haze of pain. Silas bent, retrieving his skinning knife from the mud where Croft had dropped it. He looked at the gunsmith, then at the locket Lena held. Justice, in this moment, wasn't a bullet. It was leaving Croft broken and alive in the mud, a message for Blackwood, and taking the proof away. He turned his back on the groaning man and climbed back up to Lena. She watched him approach, the fierce light in her eyes now mixed with exhaustion and profound, wary relief. He held out the knife, handle first. Might need this more than me. She looked at the blade, then at him. Slowly, she took it, her fingers brushing his. The touch was cold, brief, but it carried the weight of shared violence and shared purpose. She tucked it into the ragged waistband of her dress, the cold metal stark against the thin fabric. Silas scanned the canyon. East lay Blackwood's Badlands and the unknown reach of his malice. South lay his original path, the list of names burning a hole in his pocket. West lay something else. Distance, time, maybe a chance to make the sharps whole, to turn it into the instrument he'd sought. He looked down at the woman beside him, clutching her silver teardrop proof. Her family, his Cora, their losses were different, but the weight was the same. The path of solitary vengeance felt narrower now, overshadowed by the wider, darker threat embodied by Blackwood. He picked up the sharps, the cracked stock a reminder of fragility. He slung the recovered satchel over his shoulder. "Can't stay here," he said, his voice rough. He nodded toward the canyon's western rim, where the land rose into broken hills that bled into vast, empty plains beyond. "West, find a town. Fix this." He hefted the rifle barrel. "Then we find Blackwood." Lena looked from him to the western horizon, then back down at Croft, writhing in the mud below. Her hand tightened around the locket. A flicker of something, not hope, but grim determination, hardened her features. She didn't smile. She simply nodded, once. A silent pact sealed in blood and mud, and sheer defiance. They climbed out of the canyon, leaving the groans of the wounded behind. The rising sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the broken land. Silas led the mare, skittish but unharmed, out a side gully where she'd taken refuge. He helped Lena mount, then swung up in front of her. Her arms came around his waist, lighter now, less desperate, more certain. The locket was a small, hard presence against his back, a compass pointing toward the reckoning. He nudged the horse westward. The vastness of the plains unfolded before them, bathed in the harsh, hopeful light of morning. Behind them, the shadow of the canyon and Croft's curses faded. Ahead lay dust, distance, and a long, uncertain road to confronting a nightmare named Blackwood. But Silas Reed, the grieving widower who came to buy a rifle, rode now with a silent woman who held proof of a monster's sins, and the cracked stock of a weapon that promised justice, not just for a list of names, but for a stolen family, and perhaps for a future neither had dared imagine alone. The wind, scented with sage and endless space, carried only the sound of hooves on hard earth, a slow, steady rhythm moving towards the horizon.